In this video, we're going to use SketchUp, Lumion, and Photoshop to make this elevation rendering that you can see here. I'm going to speed this video up quite a bit, so if you need step by step, put it on half speed. Otherwise, I'm just going to talk over this, explaining some of the big steps that you need to understand for this workflow. So we'll start in our SketchUp model. I'm not going to cover too much here about the modeling portion. I just kind of wanted to give you an idea of how my model was set up. And look, I modeled this purely for this video. So I just try to make it as efficient as possible. But, I'm giving you an idea of some of the level of detail that I think is nice to have for a rendering like this. You never want to, over model anything. You always want to keep it as simple as possible. And I think the more you use Lumion or Inkscape, whatever rendering tool you are, you'll learn what the software likes and doesn't like. And that's the key when it comes to this, understanding the level of detail that you need to create the visual that you want. Because anything extra, it's not worth it. I know, when you're in school or even professional, you don't want to spend any extra time modeling something that you really don't need. Going back to understanding what the software likes and doesn't like, here I'm showing you that I want these quartz in my grass, and I know that I'm going to make that grass a 3D texture in Lumion. And if I actually model that below those quartz, the 3D grass is going to pop up through that pavement. So in fact, I need to cut out holes in the grass where I want the quartz. So I guess I say that because as I'm modeling this stuff, I'm thinking about how it's going to communicate with Lumion and what Lumion doesn't and does like. And that's ultimately how you're going to be able to model the most efficiently and create your images as quickly as possible. So, you can start to see that I truly did model this for the view that I'm rendering. And, that's something you might consider if you're in a crunch, a time crunch, and you need to produce this one shot, this money shot. You don't want to model anything unnecessary, right? So actually, this building is completely gutted. It's the only thing that's really detailed is that facade that we're facing in the camera view. And here I was just showing you that my glass isn't even 3D, right? The mullions are not 3D. It's just a simple two-dimensional component that I copied across. And that level of detail is, something you'll see throughout this model. And the thing is that I know when I was doing this that the view that I wanted, that level of detail isn't necessarily important. And the final image really isn't going to be affected by it. And there's a few other little things that I'm doing here. Something I wanted to highlight was, I was thinking about all this green or vegetation that was growing on these bridges or the balconies on the cables. So what I'm doing is just, using simple rectangular planes or tubes that I'm painting green. Because I know once I get to Lumion, I can apply a leaf material to these tubes to create that effect that there's actual vines growing on parts of my building. And here I'm just showing you, I wanted some lights, shining down on the balcony. So I just modeled simple disc and gave them their own material so I could apply emissive material to it once I got to Lumion. And then up on the roof, I wanted this tent-like fabric that made it look like there was some sort of shade up there. So I just made a really simple 2D geometry and copied it across so that you can get this effect that there's something up overhead. And now this is once again pretty random, but just thinking about some of the objects that I want to put in my model that I might not necessarily be able to find in Lumion. And this can be specific to your project. If there's this piece of entourage or some sort of side object or design that you need to highlight, you can always actually add that into your SketchUp model. Now we're going to import our SketchUp model into Lumion. I'm not covering all of these steps, so watch my previous video if you need to learn how to do that. I go, step by step for exporting, importing, and live sync. First thing I always do when I import my model is set my origin to 0, 0, 0. And actually, I bump up the Y a little bit, or else you'll end up with the Z fighting with the ground plane and Lumion. The second thing I do is set up my view. Always do this so that you know exactly what you're working towards right off the bat. And look, there's no science to exactly, this view that I'm doing here. I know that I wanted to create this elevation rendering. It's kind of unique, almost like if there's a building across the street from me and you're looking out that building at my project. And I was trying to create this balance between the streetscape on the left side of my image with the park on the right side, and how my building kind of sets in between the two, just to create that composition. Now you'll see I'll start applying materials to my model. And what I did here was I actually imported materials that I've already applied just to save some time. And you can look at these, you can slow this down and look at what I'm doing a little bit more closely. But bottom line is, applying materials to a model like this can be kind of overwhelming just because Lumion has so many different options. So my suggestion is to always, if you do something for one rendering that works really well, don't just discard it. Remember, you can actually save materials in Lumion so that, for future projects, you can import them in, and, very quickly you can start to apply them, and build up your model without spending too much time filing through the pages and pages of materials that are built into Lumion. And I'm no expert. I'm no material expert, so I'm using basically all the built-in materials in Lumion, which is totally fine. They have so many different materials and they're adding more every update. So you can really get, everything you need with simple adjustments like color, scale, reflection, stuff like that. Nothing out of the ordinary. So if you have any questions on the materials I'm using, just leave a comment and I'll get them answered. Now I'm got all of my materials applied to my site and my context. So now I'm going to focus on my project itself. And obviously, this is where a little bit more attention to detail needs to go into some of the materials you're picking. And, just like before, I've got some of these pre-made materials to speed things up. I've got a lot of wood in this. I've got some horizontal wood. I've got some vertical wood. Some of it actually has vegetation settings turned on so that looks like there's vines growing up it. And here I had this like fabric pattern on the front of my building. And I think I literally just used like one of the default Lumion curtain uh, textures. And then I kind of adjusted the scale and transparency of it to create the effect I wanted. In order to do that, it's a lot of back and forth between, applying the material, clicking render, working between the two, because what you see in your working view isn't necessarily what the output's going to be. Lumion isn't a true real time render. So working back and forth is key to making sure that you get the end result you want. And you can see I added in the vines, just like I'd mentioned before, using that green material that I placed in SketchUp. And on top of that, I actually wanted it to look like there were vines growing up the entire front face of my cables. So on that cable material, I actually did apply um, some vegetation, and using that slider, I was able to pick the Z level that it started to dissipate at. Now, moving into the interior, I didn't spend too much time applying materials here because, I knew this wasn't an interior rendering. So I didn't want to spend too much of my effort on, perfecting these materials. I just wanted enough to make it believable that there was some sort of program on the ground floor. And you'll see once we get to Photoshop, we'll do some tricks to up that energy that's happening inside on the ground level very quickly. Now, once again, just like my materials, I'm loading in my presets that I've already done to save some time. And I'm going to go through these quickly so you can look at the settings if you want to slow this down. Um, but really, this is just an offshoot of the realistic setting that's built into Lumion. And you can watch my previous video because I talk a little bit more about that in depth. Now we're going to place some vegetation around our site. Um, and this is another spot area in Lumion that you can get bogged down on really, really quickly. So the key is, once again, knowing what works. And if did, you figured something out that worked in a previous project, don't be afraid to bring it over to this one, whether it's the right plants, trees, or whatever. You can see I actually have some favorited objects that I know, get the result that I'm looking for whenever I hit render. So those sorts of things really speed up the process for me as I'm populating my model. And the key here is to make it believable, right? Have a variety of plants in these beds. Use the really cool functions in Lumion to allow you to adjust the scale and rotation to create some sort of randomness. And the key, to quickly placing vegetation is not letting yourself place every single tree and every single flower. There's no need. Figure out a way to do it efficiently, right? Use the copy paste, the group functions built into Lumion to populate your model quickly. And then you can always come back later, like I'll do here, and actually create the randomized rotation or the randomized scale to make it feel more believable rather than just copy pasted on top of each other. And I totally get this part of the workflow. It's almost like a video game, right? If you've played Sims or Roller Coaster Tycoon, it's so easy to get into the weeds of placing your entourage and your vegetation. But if you can, make this an efficient process, I think it'll help out, the end result of your image or your design, because it allows you to focus more on what's important, right? All we need to do is get our vegetation and our entourage up to a level of believability that supports our project. And here I'm using some of the built-in objects or assets that Lumion has. I wanted to show that you don't necessarily have to model everything. Sometimes it does make a lot of sense. That bench in the park there, I could have easily modeled that in SketchUp, which might make sense if I'm trying to create other drawings. But, for the purposes of this video, I wanted to highlight that there's some really great built-in objects in the Lumion library that can start to bring your rendering to life. And you can see I'm going back and forth between the working view and the render view just to make sure that as I populate some of these spaces, that I'm not blocking anything or I'm not ruining the composition of, what I'm trying to convey. And every project is different, but there will be areas that, you should spend a little bit more time populating. For me, this park, I wanted it to feel like it was a little bit more alive with other vegetation other than trees. So, this is time well spent, in my opinion, coming through and building it up a little bit more with a wider variety of plants. And remember, kind of a side note, don't get too carried away with how easy it is to place vegetation in Lumion. Make sure that, some of the choices you make, when you're placing some of this stuff, it gets transferred over to some of your other drawings, whether it be a site plan or whatever type of drawing you're doing, because this is a great example of how Lumion can be a great design tool, especially for landscape. Just make sure this doesn't get lost in, some of your other drawings. And I wanted to put some plants up on my roof. And as you can see, another good example of, do what's necessary for the image. I didn't place actual plants on my entire roof. I just did it up on that edge because I knew from my view that's all that was going to be visible. So that actually helps keep the model a little bit smaller, um, keeping some of that unnecessary geometry out of it. Now I'm going to place some cars on my streets and in front of my building. And this is a quick exercise, but be thoughtful about the composition of things. You'll see I'll keep jumping back and forth between my working and rendering view. And, I'm really curating the location of some of these cars, whether so they're not blocked by a tree or, I'm really staging it, I guess you could say, for the image. And there's nothing wrong with that. And, I had other thoughts. I wanted a reflection of cars parked in front of my building. So I lined those three cars up and to create that effect. And it's just all about building the atmosphere and believability about, the context and the movement of cars and people on the site. Take advantage of the customizability of Lumion. I didn't want a red car reflection on my building because it's so distracting. So I made it gray. And even some of the other vehicles around my project, I was like, sometimes the blues and the reds can be distracting. So, I made them more muted colors. And as I mentioned the reflection of the vehicles and that glass on the front. So this was kind of trial and error. I was trying to make the reflection look right. And I added a reflection sphere and the utilities of Lumion, and I adjusted, played with that material a little bit. But at the end of the day, I didn't want to get too bogged down because I knew I could ultimately do some photoshopping to it. Now, what you see me doing here is, I was kind of having some fun. I was testing out, if I had buildings, behind my camera facing my project, could I pick up some of those reflections to create a little bit more texture on my windows to make it feel more real? And, it kind of worked. You'll see, I'll do some tricks in Photoshop to make this a little bit more exciting. But I think bottom line is your project will be a little bit more real. So you'll actually be picking up some of the reflections of the surrounding context, assuming that you took the time to model it, whether it's vegetation. I place some trees back there too, or actual buildings. And I mentioned Photoshop because in this video I wanted to highlight, for example, the reflections. There are other ways to achieve that effect other than actually having all of your context modeled, because that can be a little bit tedious. So once we get to Photoshop, we'll cover that. And now you can see I'm populating my balconies, and these balconies aren't the most realistic, but you get the idea. Just adding some more furniture to the site in the park, all of this stuff, just minimal amount of time and effort on it, can actually make a big difference for your rendering. Making it feel more real. And once again, this is kind of like Sims, right? Don't get bogged down in all the different chair options that you have. Just remember, the ultimate goal that you're trying to achieve by placing some of these objects is a sense of space or experience, and really a sense of scale. As you place some of these things on your balconies or in your interior lobby, you start to get a feel for if this space is actually realistic, or if it's too big or too small. Now I'm spending a little bit more time on the interior, just on because I know that ground level is going to be important to see something happening on the inside. So I'm adding some seating, some plants. Once again, using only the Lumion assets. If this is your studio project or a real professional project, chances are you're going to have an interior layout and design. So this might actually already be built into your model, which is only going to save you time, right? I'm just doing something real quick to create more atmosphere on the ground floor. And you'll see I'm using the same strategy that I use on the exterior vegetation. All the built-in features that Lumion has for placing objects, whether it's the grouping, the copy paste, random rotation, random scale, it's going to allow you to quickly create environments like this without spending too much time. And look, you'll see I'm just speeding this up a lot. I'm placing more plants and just make it feel more green and lively under here. And I know this, the placement of some of these plants might not be the most realistic, but for this image maybe that wasn't important. It's more about creating that you know quick image that we can iron out later. We can figure out what how we actually lay out the floor plan of this building later. For now, we just want to create that money shot that conveys our big idea. Next, I'm going to start adding some lights to my model. And this was like a dusk shot, so some of the lighting was important. And the key here is just making sure the lighting isn't taking away from your design or your image. And sometimes it can be a little bit tricky knowing what the correct brightness level for your lights is and so forth. So just make sure as you're placing your lights, you're going back and forth between your working view and your rendering view, and even rendering a couple of tests just to make sure that the output is what you want. And what I like to do is get one light in there, adjust the settings, the color, the brightness, how I'd like, and then copy it. That way, if I ever need to go back and edit anything, I can just select the same object, in Lumion, and then adjust all of them at once. And I'll continue adding more lights to my model. You'll see now I'm going to start using some linear lights, and I'm I'm using these to create the effect that there's light coming out from that ground level. Um, Nothing too scientific about it, just playing with it, seeing what feels right, what looks right, correct color, correct brightness level. And then, the last thing I wanted to add for lighting was I wanted to create this uplighting effect on the, the face of my building that we're rendering, just to kind of, give a little bit more accent to these vertical wood slats that I have. And to do this is pretty easy because I kind of have a repetitive facade. So I was able to do one level and kind of copy them up all the way. And then, you can see they're a little too bright or a little too dim. So I was able to select all of them and make an adjustment. Next, I'll add all the entourage or people to the model. And I sped this up quite a bit just because it's a little bit repetitive and there are quite a few people in this rendering. When we talk about making a rendering feel believable, this is a great example of one of those things that can't be overlooked. Placing your entourage, um, super important. Creating a story, for your project, and I guess don't overlook placing someone in your rendering just to place them. Make sure there's a reason for it, whether they're doing something, walking a certain direction, looking or pointing somewhere. Those are really important things to think about as you place your entourage. And don't forget to use all of the cool tools that Lumion has. I really like using the array tool. As you can see, I'm doing here to place long lines of people. They don't necessarily have to be in a straight line, right? You can offset them and give them a random rotation to create some sort of crowd feeling, whether it's inside the building or out on the sidewalks. Finally, we're going to go ahead and render this. And I did print quality. That was good enough for what I needed. And then I just exported a material ID map along with the base image. Now we can open up our base render in Photoshop. And first thing I'm going to do is convert my PNG to a smart object and open up Camera Raw Filter. And this is going to be where we can do the very early base edits to our image, whether it be exposure, contrast, highlights, all of the typical, settings that you're used to tinkering with in Photoshop. This kind of just compiles them all into the base image that we have. By making it a smart object, we can always come back and edit these parameters later. And right away, you can see how much the image has already been improved by playing around with camera raw settings. Next, I'm going to just drop in my material ID map and my sky alpha map that I exported from Lumion. I'll use these later. Next, you remember I was talking about the reflection and how we could do, a simple trick in Photoshop to create a more vibrant reflection on that ground level storefront. So I found this image of a plaza. You can see I just kind of am scaling it, overlaying it on top of those windows, and using the material ID map I exported to select those windows and create a mask for that image. The first thing I do to it is I add a blur adjustment just because we don't want that reflection to be so crisp. And honestly, we don't want you to really make out what the reflection is. It's just to create a busyness or atmospheric attention to that storefront. And you can see I'm adding a levels adjustment layer. I'm playing with the overlay, whether it's screen or hard light. There's so many different ways to go about this. It's for me, it's just kind of tinkering with it until I achieve the result I want. And then next, I'm kind of doing the same process for my residential tower windows. I found this elevation of this hotel at night and just very loosely adding some more texture to the reflection on these windows, making it feel like they're a little bit more illuminated on the inside. And this is just a great example of how Photoshop can save you a lot of time, versus trying to model all those lights in Lumion. Now I'm adding this bokeh effect uh, to the image, and almost makes it feel like the building is shimmering or sparkling. And I want it to be very subtle, but I wanted to show an example of, other ways you can start to bring attention to your project. And really all it is taking that image off of Google, putting it on screen in Photoshop to get rid of the black background, and then you're left with that bokeh effect. Here, I was just having some fun. You can see how you can use Photoshop to start to bring other aspects of your model to life. I have like this graffiti image that I'm overlaying on top of this park platform bench. So it kind of looks like some artist came through and did a mural on top of it. And this is, very specific and, in some sense random, but it's cool to add a little bit of flavor to your rendering. And who knows, you can use this technique for something else in your project to tell, a more specific story that follows your design. Next, I wanted to add some more texture to the grass in my park, and this probably could have been achieved by adjusting the scale of the grass in Lumion. But here, I wanted to show that you can achieve it in different ways. So I actually imported a high-res grass texture, skewed it so that it's the right perspective, and then I think I just put it on overlay so that it kind of bled through and gave the grass a little bit of texture. And I understand the scale might not be correct, but I was purely basing it off of, visually, does it actually add some more texture to the grass? And I think it does a good job of, making it feel a little bit more lively. And then you can add a hue and saturation adjustment to make sure that the green isn't too off from the rest of the greens in your image. An important aspect of this rendering were these diamond fabric panels that were on the front of the building. And because this was so important, I wanted to make sure I could get the color exactly how I'd like. So I actually rendered them as pretty much white, but here you can see I'm applying kind of a golden transparency to them. And doing this in Photoshop versus Lumion just gives me a little bit more control over exactly what the end result is. And here you can see I just quickly added in some birds that kind of look like they're flying off of the green roof. And then to finish this up, we can do our final adjustments. Um, I kind of wanted to create this effect where my building was warm and then kind of the context and the site was a little bit cooler. So you can see I added some photo filters, one cool, one warm. And actually on the cool filter, I masked it out so that my building isn't included. And other than that, I'm just tinkering with my adjustment layers, adding new layers for brightness, contrast, kind of the finishing touches. And you'll notice I'll even go back to my original camera raw settings because I made it a smart object. I can always edit those base parameters on my original image. So now this will take us to our final image. And as you can see, I rendered this to kind of the computer screen, Lumion, a 16:9 ratio. But ultimately, I think I wanted to kind of crop this down so it's more of a square ratio. And I don't mind rendering the full aspect ratio as we did because it gives you the flexibility at the end to play with how you want to crop it. But yeah, I hope this video gave you a good understanding for a workflow between SketchUp, Lumion, and Photoshop, and how sometimes you might not get the result you're looking for in Lumion, whether it be lighting or coloring. Um, but don't worry because you can always, work that into your image in Photoshop. Please let me know if you have any questions or suggestions, and thank you for watching.